Hello, 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 and welcome back to yet another college football video. I'm sorry if the recording and shit looks way different. It's a whole new computer and shit. So it's gonna be rough for a little bit, not gonna lie. With that being said, though, today we got the start of a three-part series looking back at my top 15 teams list from before the season. I'll be honest, I'm not sure how this is gonna go. I think for the most part, I had some pretty good takes in here, but you guys will see. It it's tough. I like to go back and critique my own takes and what I thought I did right and did wrong. But let's get straight into it, man. Here was Kansas State. I had them at number 15. And keep in mind, on this list, on the preseason top 15, I did not have Texas. I did not have Oklahoma. I didn't have TCU. This was the only Big 12 representative I had in my top 15. And the reason for that being, well, they won 10 games in 2022. They got as high as number 9. And they did end up beating TCU in the Big 12 championship game. They had some massive wins. And I just figured that if I had to include a team from the Big 12, I was shaky. I didn't know what to think with Texas and Oklahoma, and I thought TCU had lost too much. I didn't know what to think with them. So I thought Kansas State was the safe pick, and I thought they were going to be better than they were this year because let's look at them. They finished the regular season at number 25, which is disappointing for most people, but they only won one less game than the previous season, and they had the same amount of losses as last season, but the highest they got at any point in the whole season was number 15, which is not good considering that's where I had them before the season even started. So I think it's fair to say that Kansas State did not meet my expectations. But let's get into the thick of things. This is their stats last season, and you could see they had massive wins against number 6 Oklahoma, number 9 Oklahoma State, number 3 TCU. I mean, they had three top 10 wins last season, which is incredibly impressive. And obviously, guys like Deuce Vaughn played massive roles in that. And I feel like the consensus thought process was that without Deuce Vaughn, Kansas State offensively was going to fall off the map, but that wasn't really the case. So keep in mind, look at their stats last season. Of course, a top 15 rushing offense. Didn't turn the ball over much whatsoever, but they weren't a very good passing offense. And the defensively, they were about middle of the pack. Nothing really special there. Only allowed 21.9 points per game, which is very impressive in the Big 12. And they also had 24 takeaways. So they did a couple things really well defensively. But keep in mind, look at those stats. Look at these stats right here. You would be surprised that they would actually go from 15th to 11th in rushing yards per. How the hell could that happen when you lose Deuce Vaughn? Well, they had a guy in DJ Giddens step up massively. They got Trayshawn out of the transfer portal from Florida State. So their running game was actually pretty respectable this year. And you see the massive jump in passing yards per game. So they actually, in a lot of ways, were a better team offensively. They still only had 12 turnovers. They didn't give up many sacks. Top 10 in points per game. Kansas State was a very underrated team this year. And if you look at the stats right there, you could make an argument that they were a top 15 to 20 offense in the whole country. The problem being defensively. Again, points per game and takeaways, Kansas State thrives, but they're not really exceptional in any specific area. And if you look at their losses, this is the thing about Kansas State. They did not lose a game by more than a possession. 3 points to a top 10 Missouri team. Over the course of the season, that loss to Missouri has become better for Kansas State. They lose to, again, a top 10 Texas team by 3 points that ends up making the college football playoff. They lose to Oklahoma State by 8 points, who ends up playing in the Big 12 championship game. And then they lose a shootout to Iowa State. That's their worst loss, I think. That's their worst loss of the season, was that 35-42 loss to Iowa State. But as a whole, I still think Kansas State was a very respectable team. Let's look at the stats. These were the key guys last year. Or sorry, these were the key guys. Uh, One second. It's not letting me go back. Oh, sure, whatever. These are the key guys this season. This is Will Howard and Trayshawn Ward. You can see, but DJ Giddens was the breakout player. I'm not saying he completely replaced a Deuce Vaughn in the backfield, but if you have over 1,500 yards from scrimmage and 13 touchdowns, you're an impressive player in my book. And the fact he's returning, he's such a young player. You would think he was like a fourth year player who was just waiting in the wings for a while, but no, he's a young guy. The receiving core, nothing to write home about. Ben Sinnott had a big year as a tight end. Phillip Brooks was the consistent guy the last season as well as this season. So again, offensively, headlined by Will Howard, was a high-powered offense. Run-first offense, certainly, but still high-powered nonetheless. These were a couple of the defensive players I thought would make a big impact preseason. This is what they did last season, notably Brendan Mott leading the team in sacks, Austin Moore as a premier linebacker, Kobe Savage, Khalid Duke had upside as a good pass rusher, and this is what they ended up doing this year. Khalid Duke doubling his sack numbers, Kobe Savage continuing to be a damn good DB, Austin Moore continuing to dominate. So they had the emergence of Jacob Parrish in the secondary, the cornerback. Again, Kansas State is not known for having a dominant group of defensive players, but I think they did their job. And look, 19 wins over a 2-year stretch for Kansas State, including a Big 12 championship win. I think we can look at that and say it was pretty good. They just didn't put together a big enough streak. They needed a win. I mentioned last season they had 3 top 10 wins. This season you needed to beat the Missouri. You needed to beat a Texas. You needed a big win like that to really change the perception, and they were so close but so far. Next up, we had Notre Dame. I had Notre Dame at a 14 going into the year, coming off a horrible 9-4 season. And last season, remember, they were ranked as high as fifth at one point. But obviously, after their losses to goddamn Marshall and things like that, their season fell apart last season. But now let's look at this year. They finished the regular season at 16. So, can you say I was pretty accurate on that? I'm not sure. I feel like Notre Dame did disappoint me personally, even though the ending ranking was pretty accurate. They won one more game than they did the year before. Their highest ranking was at 9, which I think was justified. They were never unranked like they were last season. And let's start off with last season first, looking at what they did. Obviously, you had Ohio State early. People kind of wrote that off as okay, it's Ohio State's a good team. You hold them to 21 points, but then the Marshall loss obviously just set them on a bad path. They kind of clawed their way out of it. Then you had the loss to Stanford, and this was everybody and their mother said, okay, Notre Dame's a shit show. They're 3-3, and to their credit, after that point, they really turned it around. Their offense was on fire, and they won 6 out of their last 7 games. Their only loss being to top 10 USC. Offensively, however, they were nothing to write home about. I mean, 98th best passing offense, rushing offense is respectable, but nothing impressive. Offense middle or scoring offense middle of the pack, and everything. They didn't excel at anything offensively. While defensively, you could argue they were a top 15 or 20 unit in the whole country, but obviously being paired with such a lackluster offense really put a dent in their chances. However, I think the addition of Sam Hartman is what got a lot of people, including myself, invested in the idea that Notre Dame could really kind of transform their offseason or their offense, sorry, in such a short amount of time to a high powered like you saw the last several weeks of the season last year. But unfortunately, as we all know, that was not the case. They started off on fire. That 4-0 start by Notre Dame was special. I'll give them credit where credit's deserved. Sam Hartman was a Heisman candidate, and I had them incredibly high. I thought they were going to beat Ohio State, which they should have. I'm sorry. I'm usually not one of those people that say that this team should have done this, they should have won this game. But if anybody who watched that Ohio State game honestly thought that Ohio State, outplayed Notre Dame or they deserve that win, they deserve the win. They took it from Notre Dame on the road, but Notre Dame handed Ohio State that win. Notre Dame had 4 chances to win that game and they blew them all. So obviously that loss kind of killed their season. Then they beat Duke in similar fluke circumstances, and then they get exposed by Louisville, and everybody writes them off. Similar to last season, though, once everybody writes them off, they finished the season pretty strong, but the loss to Clemson was the nail in any sort of hopes, the nail in the coffin of any sort of hopes they had of finishing the season respectably. And their bowl game against Oregon State is honestly hilarious. Neither team's starting quarterback played. Half of Oregon State's roster opted out because their head coach had already left by this point. I don't know how Oregon State was ranked in the top 18 because the team that took the field against Notre Dame was not even a top 40 team in the country. It was embarrassing. The talent difference was crazy, and Notre Dame had several players that opted out. Notre Dame didn't have their quarterback or their best player on the whole team, Audric Estime, playing, and they still dominated Oregon State. So Notre Dame, I had them at 14 before the season. They finished at 16. And let's look at the stats real quick. Offensively, you can already see the massive improvement from last season. Points per game, top 7 in the country. They did not allow as much pressure as they did last season. The passing offense took a massive jump. Rushing offense didn't take a massive jump, but guys like Audric Estime really, shouldered the load of making this a respectable team. And then defensively, I'd argue, show me how many other defenses are top 7 in 3 categories. Because Notre Dame, top 5 in yards, top 3 in passing yards, top 7 in points per game, 24 takeaways. I think Notre Dame was I'm going to make a video about my top 5 defenses and offenses. Notre Dame certainly could sneak into that top 5 defense list because they were dominant. I point to games like the Ohio State game, against Duke, against USC. They had, 4 takeaways against USC when they were playing incredibly well. They had some amazing defensive performances this season at Notre Dame. Let's get into some of their key players, though. A couple guys who I thought would be massive impact players. And the big thing for Notre Dame was I didn't know who the top receiver was going to be because they lost Michael Mayer to the draft the year before, or the previous offseason. So I didn't know who was going to fill that void. And it turns out, unfortunately, nobody did. Nobody really stepped up. Mitchell Evans, you could say, was their best receiving threat when he was healthy, but he missed several games himself. Chris Tyree, running back, converted to receiver, led the team in yards, I believe, but it was rough. And, a lot of blame by people, including myself, was placed on Sam Hartman for kind of getting fraud checked here and not being the guy everybody thought he was. But in his defense, I'm not sure how many quarterbacks in the country are putting up Heisman level numbers with the receiving core they had at Notre Dame. Also, though, Audric Estime had a monster, dominant season. Without Audric Estime, Notre Dame's probably a 5 or a 6 loss team, if we're being honest. So Audric Estime deserves a ton of credit. Joe Alt as well. He'll be a top 10 pick in the draft. They had some great players, but man, I wonder what this team would have been if they had a true number 1 receiver, because it would have been scary. And taking a look at this great defense, these are a couple guys. You see what they did last season: Xavier Watts, Benjamin Morrison, Maurice Leofau, and all these guys. Javante Baptiste, a key transfer out of Ohio State, and you can see here what they finished with. Benjamin Morrison, that game against Ohio State, he was locking up Marv. Xavier Watts led the whole country in picks, if I'm not mistaken. Javante Baptiste ended up being an important get, led the team in sacks, if I'm not mistaken. So, again, a great unit, truly a great unit. And to wrap it up here about Notre Dame, I think this was a tough year. A lot of people don't know how to judge Marcus Freeman yet in his tenure at Notre Dame. I would say if you have gone 9-4 and 10-3, if I'm not mistaken, of the 2 seasons, I would say that it's pretty good. Same as Kansas State, 19 wins in the last 2 years. But we know that Notre Dame's schedule and the teams they play, it's not easy. But I do think that they're heading in the right direction. And they just got Riley Leonard in the transfer portal. So I think next season is going to be a spotlight on Notre Dame. And I'll personally see to it that I have, a spotlight on them. And I pay close attention to what really goes on next season. But I will say this: I think I was wrong about Notre Dame, and I was misled by them. They did not meet my expectations, so I will be more harsh in my preseason evaluation on them in the following season. Next up, we had Clemson. This is the first major miss by me. Major. I know Kansas State finished 10 spots less than I had them, but they only won one less game, right? Clemson, on the other hand, and this is the thing, I said all last offseason that I did not believe in Clemson. I thought they were overrated, but I didn't have the guts to just come out and put them way below where I thought they were. I should have come out and said Clemson's not even a top 20 team in the country, which it's what I believed, but I just went with what everyone else was saying, and I thought they'd bounce back because they lost 3 games the previous year, even though they were ranked in the top 4 at one point. But I didn't have the guts to do it, and we see what happened. Clemson finished with a 9-win season, the worst in who knows how many years. They were not ranked at 4 at one point. I think the highest rank they had was ninth. But it was an embarrassing season for Clemson. And let's look at where it started, because last season was the real start of the downfall, in my opinion. Obviously, they started out 8-0, and everybody thought Clemson was going to be a playoff team, including myself. The loss to Notre Dame was shocking, especially considering that Notre Dame had 3 losses to this point, and the fact that they just dominated Clemson, that was the start of DJ's downfall. I shouldn't say the start. Clemson fans were skeptical of DJ Uiagalelei the whole season, but against Notre Dame, they completely sold on him. They ended up losing that game to South Carolina in their final regular season matchup. They beat UNC so they still won the ACC championship game, but then they got embarrassed by Tennessee in the bowl game. And you can see offensively, last season, Clemson was in desperate need of some change. Clemson didn't excel in anything offensively, which is terrifying as a Clemson fan. I'm not a Clemson fan, but if you are, clearly that's cause for concern. Defensively, they were still a good unit, but my argument was that Clemson wasn't even a top 10 defense last season. Maybe you could make the argument from 12 or 13, but Clemson had fallen off defensively, so they weren't even a great team offensively or defensively anymore, which is why I thought going into this season that they were on the path for complete just an explosion. I don't know what to say. I thought that they were going to completely collapse this season, which ended up being true. And let's look at the numbers. Offensively, not much difference. Actually worse in several categories offensively, notably the points per game and the turnovers just not being where it needs to be. And then defensively, I think they actually impressed me. Certainly leading the country in takeaways impresses me. That's what I'll clap it up, because I said some doubtish things about Clemson's defense, and they proved me wrong, and then some. And then if you look at their schedule right here, obviously they started off horribly. They were 4-4 at one point. They got fraud checked immediately by Duke, dominated by Duke week 1. Then the Florida State game was an amazing game, which they actually lost themselves. They had the chance to make a short game-winning field goal, which they missed. The circumstances behind that were hilarious, by the way, but they cost themselves the game against Florida State. Then they lose to Miami and NC State, and then they wrap up their season pretty well, actually, with multiple ranked wins, including 2 SEC wins against South Carolina and Kentucky. That Kentucky game was also absurd, but so they finished the season strong. But you know, so you leave yourself feeling in just a really weird situation, because at one point Clemson was 4-4, and it had come to fruition that Dabo and his outdated coaching style of not getting players out of the transfer portal. And Clemson has had a multiple year problem at this point of wide receiver. When was the last time Clemson had a true number 1 receiver? It's been at least 2 years. I don't even know who it was before then, but they don't have receiver talent at Clemson, which obviously is making it incredibly difficult for whoever's at quarterback, whether it's DJ or Cade Klubnik. So let's take a look at some of these guys. And before the guys, this was the exact slide I put up in the preseason top 15. I looked right in this camera it was a different computer. I looked right in the camera and I said, "Tell me that this is a good offense," because I didn't believe it. Nobody believed it. Will Shipley and Phil Maffa was a great duo last season, and I expected them to be the keys to this offense, and it was. I was completely unsure about Cade Klubnik. I had not been impressed by him in the limited action he saw. I didn't see any receiver talent, honestly. I didn't see any, spectacular guys on Clemson's perimeter, and unfortunately that became true because, look, Their number one receiver actually had less yards. I think Antonio Williams had 600 plus yards last season. No receiver even had 600 yards from Clemson. So Cade Klubnik, the stats are very mediocre, but I understand it. It's the Sam Hartman situation. If you don't have good receivers, you can't ask, especially a young quarterback like Cade Klubnik. At least Hartman's like 30, but you can't ask a young quarterback like Klubnik to just elevate guys who on their best day are maybe a respectable wide receiver too. You need wide receiver ones in college football. You need guys that are going to the NFL in the first day or two. Tyler Brown, Bo Collins, they're just not getting it done. Brenning Stool was a solid tight end this year, and Phil Moffitt and Shipley were one of the best duos in college football. Both guys combining for over 1,000 yards from scrimmage, combining for 20 touchdowns. It truly was a great duo that kept their offense afloat. Without one of these guys, or God forbid both of these guys, Clemson, disaster of a team. And then defensively, obviously the strength of this team, which I doubted heavily. Guys like Barrett Carter, Jeremiah Trotter stepped up massively. Nate Wiggins solidified himself as a top 12 pick, possibly in the draft. Um, it was a good unit, and I got to pitch respect where respect is due. They stepped up, even though the talent on paper, like who was the number one pass rusher for this team? A lot of their pressure came from their linebackers. They didn't have a real, dominant edge rusher like we were used to seeing, but it didn't matter. You got three guys on here with at least 5 sacks. And then the secondary, you got four safeties up there. Obviously, Nate Wiggins being locked down on the outside. It was a great unit, which I pitch respect to because, if they had a slightly better offense that wasn't setting them up in short field a lot of times, maybe this would be a top 2 or 3 unit in the whole country. So it was impressive nonetheless. Quick summary on Clemson. I knew they were fraudulent. I just didn't have the guts to fully come out and say it. Um, I am going to give them no benefit of the doubt moving forward because it still looks like to this point Dabo is completely ignoring the transfer portal, which in my opinion he needs to go. If you're not willing to adapt to the modern era of college football, then you're really just holding the team back because that's what he's doing right now. He's not fixing the problems at Clemson. He's not going out and getting receiver talent. The talent they have right now is not good enough, and it's going to continue to lead them down the same path. I wouldn't even be shocked if Clemson wins 8 games next year or 7. I just think they're on the decline with no end in sight. So Clemson is on they're going nowhere fast basically. Next up, I had Utah, and this is the strangest one for some obvious reasons. I mean, I saw what they did last season: 10 wins, Pac-12 champions, I believe, beating USC, got as high as number 7, and it's so tough because the team we saw last year didn't even get a chance this year, really, which kind of just felt weird. Obviously, you didn't have Cam Rising at all. You didn't have guys like Brant Keithy. Utah was probably the most perpetually injured team in college football this year. And I know everybody says, yeah, well, injuries happen. Well, if you don't have the quarterback that everybody thought you'd have at all in the whole season, you kind of get a bit of an exception there. And I'm not saying that an 8-5 year for Utah is inexcusable. They finished the season not even ranked, even though they started out as high. Well, they didn't start out. They got as high as number 7, but it's understandable. I mean, this wasn't the team that everybody thought we were going to be. The roster was just not enough. You're not going to win as many games. You're not going to win double-digit games in a stacked Pac-12 with Bryson Barnes as your quarterback. And even worse was fucking whatever his name was, Nate Johnson. Like, you're not winning 10 games with those guys. So let's get into it. What they did last season and what they did so well. First of all, last season, they were a top 12, 15 defense in the country in the Pac-12. But they also had the capability on offense to go out and win shootouts. This was a run-first team with a quarterback who knew how to get after it. 11th in the country in points per game, top 20 in yards per game and rushing yards per game, and fewest sacks allowed per game. I mean, they played 1, 2, 3, 4 teams in the top 12. They won 2 of them, both being against USC. They also played UCLA, which they lost, but they played Oregon State. They dominated an Oregon State team who won 10 games. They beat Arizona, who was on the way of turning things around. They beat Washington State close, who had a good quarterback in Cam Ward. So I think Utah last season was incredibly slept on besides their games against USC. And by the end of the season, the hardcore fan was saying, hey, watch out for Utah. They didn't get enough attention last season. and that kind of set them up for failure because obviously you go to this season, it's not even the same team. It's not the same team. I'm trying not to sound like a Utah. I really don't care about Utah whatsoever, but I acknowledge the fact that they were put in an extremely tough situation. They played six ranked teams just in the regular season. And the teams they played that weren't ranked, Florida, Baylor, Colorado. Hate on Colorado all you want. That was by the end of the season they were not the worst team in college football. So the bowl game in Northwestern, that was a horrible performance. I'll say that much. That they looked awful in the bowl game versus Northwestern. But it's just 117th in the country in passing yards per game. Defensively, they're still amazing. I still think those are the top 10 defense in the country because you look at 82.8 rushing yards per loud, or top 20 in yards per game, points per game, and sacks per game. They did a lot of things right defense. They played so tough. In those first four games of the season, I thought literally every single game of the season until the Oregon game, I honestly thought Cam Rising was going to come back any day now. I thought he'd play the Florida game. But unfortunately, his injury was just too severe. And at his older age, 33 years old, whatever it is, it's tougher for his body to recover from those types of injuries. And, he didn't end up playing. Well, at least we're going to see him next year. But they had the roster that we were hyped up and ready to see never even took the field, really. Um, you can see how good Cam Rising looked just based off his stats from last season. All of the running. Take a good hard look at this screen, right? Thomas Yasmin, Brant Keithy, um, fucking Jalen Glover, Emery Simmons, all these guys we thought were gonna, Micah Bernard, all these guys we thought were gonna come in and be key contributors for them. And now look at this. Nate Johnson and Bryson Barnes combining for 2,500 yards and embarrassing. They had Sion Vaki, honestly. Sion Vaki coming over from the defense to kind of he low key, besides Jaquindon Jackson, was their offensive MVP this season. He only played like half the games on offense. It was rough, man. It's really no positives to take away from this offense, man. It was doomed from the start once Cam Rising wasn't coming back. Then defensively, again, I said already a stacked unit, headed up by guys like Cole Bishop, um, Jonah Ellis had a monster season, Karen Reed, and Jonah Ellis ended up getting 12 sacks on the year, and he didn't even play the last couple games. It was just a good unit. No guys that, I don't think any of these guys are five-star players, but Utah just has kind of a stick about them, like coming out playing hard, out toughing their opponent, being the more physical team, and that's what they did all year. So, in summary, it's tough, man. I'm not gonna come out and say they were disappointing because it's kind of almost like a not available grade because you can't come out and say that they were a letdown or anything like that because they didn't even really get a chance. I think if Cam Rising played, I'm not trying to be the hypothetical guy, but I think they win at least two more games. I think they're at least a 10-win team, same as last year, and we look at them completely differently. So I don't know, man. I don't really want to lean too hard one way or another. I kind of just call this whole season a wash, to be honest, and try and see what they put together heading into next year. Next up, we had Tennessee, who you could argue right up there with Clemson as the most disappointing team nationally because there were a lot of people. They won't admit it now, but there were a lot of people who really honestly thought Tennessee was a title contender. And I was not one of those people because I recognized how hard it is to replace a Heisman level quarterback as well as multiple receivers. But I thought I had what's the word? Like skeptical optimism in Joe Milton. I thought the system was just so good that anybody could step in and at least be serviceable. And Joe Milton, while he was serviceable, they were not able to replace. I think so much emphasis was placed on could they replace Hendon Hooker, and not enough emphasis was placed on can they replace Jalen Hyatt and Cedric Tillman and guys like that. Last season they were as high as number one. It was a magical season last year for Tennessee. They won 11 games. This season, not the case whatsoever. They dropped to 9-4. The highest they got was number 9. Lowest they got was 23rd. The longest win streak they put together was just 3 games. It's kind of crazy. Again, taking a look at their magical season last year, the best offense in the country. I'll say that without any hesitation. They led the country in yards and points per game. I mean, come on. Only had 11 turnovers. Defensively, though, not great, obviously. The game you lost to South Carolina was embarrassing. The Georgia game, they got fraud checked, It's hard, it's tough to say fraud check because they had a good win over Alabama, a very good win over LSU, but the Florida game, Florida, it was kind of an inflated resume because Pitt, Florida, and Kentucky, obviously none of those teams were ranked material as the season wore on. We come to realize that. The Missouri win was very good though. Missouri win was great. LSU win was great. Alabama win was great. The fraud checked against Georgia and South Carolina was embarrassing. But they finished strong at least, so they had a lot of optimism, right? And looking into this season, obviously, just look at the offensive numbers, the vast drop. But I said this before the season that they would be a damn good running offense, and they were. They were top 10 in the country because they had a plethora of talent, and they had to lean on the running attack because obviously the drop off in quarterback play and the major drop off in receiver talent. But you lost to Florida, who was not a good team whatsoever. Alabama, you got a big lead early. You got that big lead on Alabama, then you choked that game. You got a 7-0 lead against Georgia. They get steamrolled you. Missouri steamrolled you. I mean, they got outscored 17 to fucking 74 back-to-back weeks. So they really got put in place by the two best teams in the East. Their bowl game against Iowa was hilarious. Who the hell thought Iowa deserved to be playing anybody ranked? Why the hell was Iowa ranked? I hate Iowa. I'm sorry, but defensively they actually stepped up massively. Eighth in the country in sacks per game, only 20.5 points per game allowed. Top 20 in rushing defense. Like they took a massive step up defensively. They became a much more physical team. Ground and pound, tough nosed defense. But it's such a massive drop off to go from possibly the best air raid offense in the country to just not even a threat in a lot of games through the air. You had 4 games this season where you put up 20 or less points. Who would have thought that from Tennessee coming into the year? Taking a look here at a couple of their key players, what they had done previously. Obviously, I knew Jalen Wright, Jabari Small, Dylan Sampson. That was going to be a dynamic trio here. But the receivers, I didn't know who it was going to be. I thought Brew McCoy. He got hurt going into the season. I thought they would use Dante Thornton a lot. They didn't use him at all, so it was left up to Ramel Keaton, Squirrel White, and they weren't those guys. They weren't good enough. Squirrel White ended up putting over 800 yards, Ramel Keaton 600 something. Joe Milton, honestly, he was overhated, but he had too much pressure. Following up Hendon Hooker, he had a couple people calling him the Heisman before the season even started, so he was never going to live up to those expectations. But I thought, considering the lack of talent he had. It's a story of all these teams, right? There has not been a team so far on this list that had a good amount of receiver talent. And honestly, I think that's what separates some of these teams in college football. And Joe Milton, just like Sam Hartman, just like Cade Klubnik, was not able to overcome the lack of receiver talent because it was prevalent. There was nobody that really stepped up in that room. But Dylan Sampson, Jalen Wright, Jabari Small carried this offense, literally and figuratively, in a lot of ways. Taking a look at the defense, guys who they had a lot of guys who needed to step up, a lot of guys who were unproven from a unit that disappointed last season, but they had a lot of potential. And I do think that they recognized and they fulfilled that potential this season. Guys like James Pierce, 10 sacks, Tyler Barron, 6 sacks, um, Kamal Hayden, Jalen McCullough, like they were some good players on Tennessee's defense. A lot of them are leaving in the transfer portal, but Tennessee, it was a very weird thing to see how they changed their play style so suddenly, but it was out of necessity, right? If it was up to them, they would have played the exact same way as last year, but unfortunately for them, they couldn't. They just didn't have the talent. And in summary for Tennessee, they were a disappointment. I put too much pressure on the new guys on offense to fulfill the shoes of last year's team, and that was never going to happen. So I overrated Tennessee. They were massively overrated by everybody, really. And I don't know what the future is for them. I know they got Nico, but I'm going to put a lot less pressure on Tennessee moving forward than there was going into this season. But that's going to be it for this video, man. I hope this shit turns out right so I don't have to record it a second time. This new computer is fucking bugging. I hate it. But I'm trying to just figure out ways to record videos for y'all. But leave a like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace.